Once upon a time, the British military was the very strongest in the whole world, dominant and uncontested at sea, damn near unbeatable on land. But it has been a really long time since the years of the Pax Britannica, and in the modern aftermath of the Cold War, Britain's armed forces have languished and then atrophied. It is a problem that the defence world has understood for years, even in Britain itself, and it's a problem that we and many other creators have worked desperately to call attention to. But today, at the start of the summer 2025, the United Kingdom finally has a plan to stand on its own 2 feet. Just days ago, at the time of this being released, Britain's leaders have unveiled a grand strategic approach to reform, reshape, and reinvigorate the once great British military. As the United Kingdom makes ready for a new era of global tensions and squares up alongside its NATO allies for a war on the European continent, it's this new strategic vision that will either return Britain to its former glory or condemn it to the annals of history. This is the Strategic Defence Review, the United Kingdom's long-awaited and desperately needed plan to save itself. The sequence of events that led to the release of Britain's new Strategic Defence Review, an interesting story in their own right, but for our purposes today, suffice it to say that this review, or SDR, was long overdue by the time that it was charted. After 14 straight years of rule by a constantly morphing Tory government and over 3 decades sitting comfortably under the umbrella of American hegemony in Europe, Britain's military has been in a sorry state for quite a while now. Lower morale, lower on recruits, and cutting corners on deployments at the same time as valuable equipment has been left to rust, the British Armed Forces have endured a series of rapidly compounding problems as the nation's former leaders have looked on with a rather tepid sense of disinterest. At the start of this year, the very same country that boasts the globe's 6th largest economy, a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and one of just 5 globally recognized nuclear arsenals, couldn't fill its own largest stadium with members of its standing military. And while that state of affairs might have been acceptable in the immediate post-Cold War, it certainly is not acceptable now. In 2025, the nations of Europe and the NATO alliance are enduring a 4th consecutive year of watching the Russian Federation invade the sovereign nation of Ukraine. Those same nations are watching the US pull back from its long-held security commitments and push for an unprepared Europe to handle its own defense. As the British military has languished, warfare has changed rapidly. Mass-produced unmanned drones have become incredibly important to the battles of today, and innovations like artificial intelligence will be even more important to the battlefields of tomorrow. Meanwhile, British Defence Minister Al Khan's admitted that this very year, if the British Army were to fight a war similar to the war that Ukraine is fighting today, then the entire army could be, quote, expended in as few as, wait for it, 6 months. Other military leaders, speaking to the BBC in early May, suggested that in that sort of war, Britain would run out of ammunition and supplies in weeks, or even in a span of just days. So when the UK's current government assumed its new role in 2024 and then watched Britain's situation grow even more dire in the following months, it was of paramount importance that the nation's leaders finally swing into action. The SDR that was promised to the British public was described by the nation's Defence Secretary John Healey as, quote, the biggest shake-up of UK defence for over 50 years. But while we'll certainly be evaluating that claim as this episode goes on, we first got to dig into the plan itself. A nearly 150-page document that lays out the next decade and more for the entire British military. And across the entire plan, perhaps the single best place to start is with a seismic shift in how the UK imagines the threats that it faces. No longer does the British military envision its role as an expeditionary one, travelling far afield to operate on other continents or as part of a broader coalition. Instead, the UK is preparing to face what the report itself describes as a, quote, direct military threat from a highly capable state adversary. That is to say, a nation with the ability and the intent to strike the UK directly. From Britain's perspective, that nation, it's almost certainly Russia, although the review also acknowledges that the UK can no longer rely on its old approach, fighting abroad to keep threats away from Britain. But if war against Russia is on the horizon, then the UK doesn't just need to fix the problems of decay and low recruitment that it's been battling for decades. It needs to change everything, starting with the long-held assumption that Britain's military should expect to take on the world by itself. That is perhaps the biggest assumption that Britain's new strategy turns on its head. In the vision for British defence that the government has laid out, the UK's defence is explicitly NATO-first, with London and its soldiers expected to fight in lockstep with the alliance's members in Europe and North America. The British government is calling for its entire military strategy to be built in a way that allows it to integrate as seamlessly to the NATO alliance as possible, everywhere from the training that it provides to its troops, to the equipment it procures, to the development initiatives that it prioritises. It makes clear that Britain isn't going to abandon or ignore its other global allies. It'll work to be a leader within the NATO alliance, instead of being just another participant. But where Britain once worked hard to ensure that it could be militarily independent from any other nation, even its allies, the goal now is the exact opposite of that. If London and Moscow find themselves at war, then it won't be British soil that comes under direct threat of a land invasion first. But it's only by strengthening and leading NATO that Britain could ensure that Russian forces never even get close. In order to integrate itself more fully into the NATO alliance, the Strategic Defence Review calls on the British military to embark on several major initiatives at once. The UK is going to need to strengthen and possibly extend its nuclear deterrent, a prospect that we're going to discuss at length later on. It'll also need to build its military into a state where it can deploy all across the continent and can properly host NATO troops deployed onto its own soil. It'll optimize its forces to fight on and defend the territory of NATO member nations, and it'll provide its troops with equipment that's both interoperable with other NATO member militaries and fills critical gaps in capability that other nations have not yet addressed. The plan explicitly calls for most of the British Army's deployable capability to be committed to NATO rather than homeland defence, and for ammunition and heavy equipment to be forward deployed across Europe. That, of course, is a reflection of the fact that Britain sees no real threats to speak of on its own western front, unless the people of Iceland were suddenly to suffer a profound change in character. The report calls for London to take on greater responsibility within NATO command and control infrastructure, traditionally managed by Americans, and to lead the way in developing new methods and means of warfighting and industrial development. Beyond a reorientation toward NATO partners, the SDR calls for a rethink of Britain's entire order of battle on the ground, breaking its new capabilities into what's called a 20-40-40 split. The strategy outlined in the report calls for 20% of the British Army's capabilities to go toward operating heavy weapons systems like main battle tanks and armoured fighting vehicles, 40% toward the use of single-use munitions including artillery fire and kamikaze drones, and 40% toward repeated-use drones, including ones that are capable of launching their own airstrikes. That approach, according to the SDR, will, quote, create a British army which is 10 times more lethal to deter from the land. Now, notably, the plan does not call for a large increase in the number of British soldiers deployed to the battlefield, instead indicating that 73,000 regular troops, the number that Britain has now, will be slowly raised to 76,000 in the next half-decade. Says the report, and we'll quote here, the quality of its people is the foundational strength of the British military. And just to highlight that, it's quality, not quantity. Then there's Britain's nuclear deterrent, where the SDR acknowledges an urgent need to upgrade on several fronts. Perhaps most important of all in that regard is the decision to expand Britain's nuclear deterrent to an air launch capability. Unlike nations with a robust nuclear triad, that is to say, delivery mechanisms via air, land and sea, the UK has relied exclusively on submarine-launched warheads for the last few decades. Now, however, London is looking into the purchase of advanced warplanes that can deliver tactical nuclear bombs to their target, and while the SDR itself doesn't specify what the UK is after, the Times indicates that Britain is looking at a new batch of American-made F-35As with the ability to carry nuclear gravity bombs. Not only that, but Britain will invest some £15 billion, equivalent to over $20 billion US, into efforts to procure new British-made sovereign nuclear warheads, along with a wider modernisation of Britain's nuclear infrastructure. And from nuclear matters, let's move on to advanced warfighting technology, an area where Britain's leaders clearly understand that their nation is a step behind. The report calls for £1 billion to be spent on developing a so-called digital targeting web, a system that would bring together artificial intelligence, highly sophisticated software, and advanced sensor technology on ships, fighter aircraft, and other warfighting equipment. When brought together in unison and used in real time, that technology would grant Britain far greater situational awareness and battlefield targeting capability. It's especially important for a nation with a 6th-generation fighter jet on the way, with 6th-gen aircraft expected to serve partly as a fighter jet, but most importantly as a command and control data center to sort through and make sense of incredible amounts of battlefield data in real time. Beyond its digital targeting web, the UK intends to place a heavy emphasis on digital technologies in the future, improving both its ability to partner with private sector providers to get advanced kit and its ability to adopt and integrate the newest technologies fast in order to keep its fighting forces on the cutting edge. The nation's cyber warfare capabilities are also expected to improve substantially with the introduction of a dedicated cyber and electronic command. On defence industrial matters, Britain intends to build 6 new munitions and weapons factories, investing another £1.5 billion to that effect. The goal is to create a means of production that's, quoting here, always on, continually producing warfighting equipment instead of stopping and starting whenever individual batch orders come in. The ultimate goal here is for the UK to produce up to 7,000 long-range weapons, not explicitly named, but thought to consist of ballistic and cruise missiles at the very least. Simultaneously, the Ministry of Defence is going to be given a mandate to drastically increase the UK's stockpiles of munitions, addressing a core weakness that's afflicted not just Britain, but the entire NATO alliance. The report calls for the UK to invest heavily into its defence industrial base, while both prioritising its own investment in civilian and military dual-use technologies and getting NATO to do the same thing. Under the purview of the new defence strategy, each branch of the British Armed Forces is going to be overhauled. The Army will have its equipment refurbished and complemented with new advanced hardware, while its recruiting process will be made more flexible and less bureaucratic than the current way of doing things. In the sky, the SDR calls for Britain to pair its advanced F-35s with a combination of autonomous collaborative aircraft and expendable drones used for kamikaze-style attacks. At the same time, the UK will invest in robust air defence networks to shield against incoming ballistic missiles and prioritise the mass procurement of unmanned drones to accompany frontline soldiers. Beneath the waves, London will invest in the construction of up to a dozen nuclear-powered attack submarines in an effort to play a more active role in the AUKUS programme between Britain, the US and Australia. Those submarines will replace 7 Astute-class attack submarines currently in the British fleet, and they'll join an expected 8 submarines that Australia will field in the next few years. At the same time, a new surveillance program, codenamed Atlantic Bastion, will arrange for the protection of undersea internet cables. Meanwhile, on the water's surface, the report calls for Britain to work with commercial and international partners to form a stronger fleet of anti-submarine frigates, a, quote, more powerful but cheaper and simpler fleet. Its aircraft carriers in particular will be hybridized to use drone technology alongside crewed aircraft. And importantly, the report does not shy away from the fact that in a potential all-out war, Britain itself is going to get hit. The SDR calls for Britain to better prepare to withstand direct attacks and recover quickly when it does, while at the same time expanding its options to retaliate against a foreign adversary. It directly calls out the ways that life in the UK could be disrupted if the military were asked to fight a war in its current state, including missile and air attack on British critical infrastructure, sabotage and large-scale cyber attack, attacks on the British economy, and attempts to sow public discord. The report calls for a whole-of-society approach to defence in future years, focusing on preparing the public for the rigours of a wartime environment. The numbers of young British cadets are expected to swell by up to 30% in the next few years, ideally reaching 250,000 cadets enrolled after a few more years, while the Ministry of Defence will commit to public outreach efforts to bring the importance of defence and the range of threats Britain faces to the awareness of the British public. The MOD's initiatives will, in part, hope to reconnect British defence to British society and reintroduce the harsh reality that the UK could find itself in a major conflict during its people's lifetimes. All across the report, the British government lays out a range of other priorities. It recommits to international organisations like the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance and AUKUS Partnership and emphasises the need to protect and reinforce critical infrastructure on the home islands. It commits to enhancing and refurbishing the living conditions of military homes, where facilities have been in a very poor state for a very long time. It's been a major factor in so many service members leaving their roles sooner than expected. It calls for enhanced partnership with British intellectuals in the defence world outside of the military itself in order to foster debate, introduce new ideas, and ensure that Britain's brightest minds can be put to work indirectly if need be. But if the focus of the report had to be summed up in 2 words today, those would be warfighting readiness, a principle that Prime Minister Keir Starmer personally described as the new, quote, central purpose of our armed forces ahead of the review's publication. In both Britain and the rest of Europe, the greatest lesson learned from Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been the ultimate importance of simple military readiness. That if a nation doesn't have the mundane equipment or the numbers of personnel to actually fight a war, then advanced-looking tech and claims about having an elite military, well, they're practically irrelevant. The best howitzers, the best stealth fighters in the world are useless if they run out of shells and missiles to go bang bang. Even the best trained troops are doomed if they're placed into head-to-head contest where they're outnumbered 10-1. If the UK can make the changes the Strategic Defence Review lays out, then it'll be able to address those core deficiencies and make the military into a genuine deterrent again, while ensuring that it's got all the advanced capabilities to excel on a modern battlefield. Now look, as we dig into the implications of the Strategic Defence Review, we're going to focus on the details before we zoom out to the big question of whether this entire approach to defence is actually going to be enough. Before we get there, we got to take a look at whether this new defence strategy, in principle, addresses the problems that are known to bog down the British military. In some areas, the answer is a simple and unequivocal, well, yes, it does. For example, the decision to restore an air-launched nuclear deterrent in addition to the existing submarine-based deterrent would constitute a massive improvement to Britain's overall deterrent capabilities. An improved focus on advanced technology would certainly help Britain to prepare for a more modern battlefield, while by emphasizing an expanded role for unmanned drones so thoroughly, the nation's military leaders have demonstrated that they've learned the greatest single lesson of the war in Ukraine. Improving the state of Britain's military accommodations, cutting down the bureaucracy involved with joining the armed services, or proactively engaging with the public on matters of defence also certainly isn't going to hurt. Just as unequivocal, but somewhat more striking, is the fact that this new approach to defence seems to indicate that the British government has finally recognised the real limitations of its own military. The nation has maintained for a long time, almost certainly too long, that its fighting forces were among the very best in the world, ready to take on any adversary across the globe. But even though the nation's military does still excel in some areas, the idea that the British Armed Forces could square up against a peer adversary has been laughable for quite a while now. In its public-facing remarks and new grand strategy, the military appears to be making the direct admission that it cannot challenge a nation like Russia or China in the traditional sense. Sources from Britain's Ministry of Defence have directly confirmed as much, acknowledging that the military approach that made sense during the comfortable years following the Cold War is badly under-equipped to deal with the security challenges facing Britain today. And with that comes an entirely new way of thinking about the UK's armed forces, and specifically choosing to fight future wars in a way that expects that Britain will be at a numbers disadvantage when discussing troop count alone. Britain is well on its way to adopting a Ukraine-style approach to thinking about its force mass, where its strength doesn't simply come from pairing troops with manned equipment and sending them to the front, but instead by integrating troops and manned equipment with the vast potential of unmanned or even autonomous systems. Not only that, but by orientating itself toward a committed NATO-first approach, Britain is able to think about its troops within the context of a much larger force. No longer do British strategists need to think in terms of organising their own independent forward deployments. Instead, the British military goes where NATO goes. As for how British troops would actually integrate with the NATO alliance, the idea of a 20-40-40 split does provide some interesting hints. Again, that means 20% of the British Army's capabilities devoted to heavy fighting vehicles, 40% to artillery fire and one-way attack drones, and 40% to larger reusable drone platforms. But nowhere in that split is there much room for infantry operations, and that might actually be for a really good reason. Comprising just under 75,000 troops in early 2025, the British Army simply doesn't have the numbers to match Russian forces on the battlefield. That's an area where other NATO allies might be better suited. Poland, with its goal to field 250,000 soldiers, Turkey, with its existing 400,000, Finland, with an expected wartime army of nearly 200,000, or the USA, of a standing army nearly 500,000 strong before counting the reserves or the National Guard. Adding a couple of tens of thousands of British soldiers to that mix probably wouldn't tip the scale if those soldiers were simply going down into the trenches with their rifles and hoping for the best. But A force of over 70,000 specialized troops spread all up and down the battlefield could make a far bigger impact, especially if those troops were bringing advanced drone technology and formidable war machines wherever they went. One of the biggest lessons learned in Ukraine, for Britain in particular, has been the way that drones and unmanned systems can make up a deficit in frontline personnel. There, Ukrainian drones have ensured that the nation's smaller, exhausted fighting force can hold steady against larger numbers of Russian troops across a massive front line. That approach has allowed Ukraine to thrive in an environment that Grace Cassie, one of the Strategic Defense Review's authors, described as, quote, cognitive, autonomous, and contested in milliseconds at a time when advances in AI, quantum, and biotech are progressing at a dizzying speed. For Britain, where advanced technology is abundant but greater troop numbers probably won't be achieved, it makes a hell of a lot more sense to focus on serving as a force multiplier for other NATO member militaries rather than trying to do everything by themselves. A continental front line that's mostly being held by the troops of other nations would be far stronger if it were reinforced by highly competent, highly mobile drone and armored operators who are capable of traveling up and down the front and contributing wherever they can make the biggest difference. And for a country that's going to struggle to increase the size of its military, the report's focus on making the most of its existing troops goes well beyond that. According to sources from the Ministry of Defense, the nation intends to mobilize a separate force for national defense, a home guard of sorts that can watch over the British home islands themselves. Not only would this force be able to provide a lower-cost alternative to the British Army for the same task, but it would keep the bulk of Britain's soldiers available to mobilize toward a continental front, even in times of heightened danger when sabotage attacks against British soil are more likely. The UK's ambition to strengthen but simplify its navy should cut down on training needs, maximise the amount of punch per sailor that its ships can provide, and give an opportunity to integrate new technologies that reduce the need for sailors even further. Just as important as the push for greater integration with NATO is the broader geographic shift that the Strategic Defense Review seems to imply. As the report states, the UK intends to maintain its commitments to alliances and partnerships all over the world, but those other alliances will come in second, behind Britain's NATO commitments, and its larger strategic approach will reflect that. Take, for example, Britain's up to 12 new attack submarines. According to Ministry of Defense sources, these attack submarines will create jobs at home, they'll help to build out Britain's defense industrial capacity, but once they go operational, they'll basically be devoted to the AUKUS program alongside Australia and America, meaning that they'll be a large part of Britain's commitment to the Indo-Pacific. What's not clear under the layout of the SDR is that Britain's Indo-Pacific commitments will go any further. The same could be said for deployments to the Middle East, where the UK acknowledges that future threats might emerge, but doesn't appear particularly interested in sending troops, instead deepening its relationships with regional actors that can handle Middle Eastern security while keeping British interests in mind. Although it's highly unlikely that the entirety of the British military will be deployed to continental Europe, the objective is clearly to keep as high a proportion of the military available for European defence as possible. And in regard to its defence industrial base, the SDR shows that British leadership at least understands the systemic problems facing European militaries. From shipbuilding to munitions to research and development, the nation's new strategic approach focuses heavily on the need to build at scale, not just creating the factories and dry docks, but ensuring that production is ongoing at all times and that the tens of thousands of required industrial workers are ready at a moment's notice. Britain has clearly learned the lessons of the grueling attritional warfare style that Russia prefers, understanding that the entire Russian model relies on attacking with such high volume of munitions that the only way to answer is by firing higher volumes in return. From artillery shells to kamikaze drones, Britain must have the stocks to answer, not just in an initial exchange, but continually, during a war that could last months or even years. The approach laid out in the Strategic Defense Review may not get Britain across the finish line, at least not by itself, but it is a really good start. At the same time, the SDR's willingness to maximize Britain's strengths has translated successfully to industry and technology. The UK's focus on a digital targeting web, sophisticated unmanned and autonomous systems, cyber warfare capabilities, and the development of advanced warfighting equipment seize on Britain's expertise as a world-renowned centre for innovation. The newfound focus on dual-use technologies will allow Britain to better liaise with private partners, while its willingness to consult strategic thinkers outside the military will capitalise on Britain's immensely disproportionate numbers of knowledgeable armchair generals. According to Ministry of Defense sources, the nation may well collaborate directly with Ukrainian companies on the production of advanced drones, while the new strategy already commits to partnership with a range of international allies on other procurement initiatives. That overall focus on doing what Britain does best immediately brings the nation closer to accomplishing its ultimate strategic objective: to become, quoting the Strategic Defense Review, a leading tech-enabled defense power with an integrated force that deters, fights, and wins through constant innovation at wartime pace by the year 2035. At the very least, we at WarFronts feel confident in saying that the UK's new Strategic Defense Review is headed in all of the right directions. Britain's defence leaders have demonstrated a clear grasp of the nation's prior failings, as that co-author we mentioned before, Grace Cassie, puts it, quoting here, "Put simply, the UK has raided the future to pay for the past." Those same defence leaders have comprehensively identified the important lessons of the Ukraine war and of other conflicts around the world in explaining the nature and the trajectory of modern warfare. They've been able to articulate a multi-layered approach to address many of the UK's compounding problems all at once, while maximising the nation's strengths, addressing its weaknesses, and demonstrating the required humility to place itself alongside a larger alliance rather than going down with the sinking ship that was British military autonomy. But as of right now, the Strategic Defence Review and the new military strategy that it articulates, they're a matter of theory. Its principles have yet to be tested under the rigours of real-world defence, its plans and initiatives have yet to take shape, and the capabilities it promises have yet to be fielded. So, as impressive an overhaul as it is in theory, we still have to ask the toughest question of all: can the UK actually get this done? Now, certainly, experts who've had time to digest the report have pointed out a few areas of concern. One particular reason for skepticism is the fact that the review didn't directly increase Britain's defence spending, despite a clear need to do precisely that. As of now, the UK is committed to spending 2.5% of its GDP on defence by 2027 and 3% by or before the year 2034. NATO, however, is expected to request that all its members agree to bump spending to 5% of GDP at an upcoming summit, including 3.5% on direct military expenditure and the remainder on other security-related investments. For the UK to miss an opportunity to bump up its own commitments via the SDR, well, that was taken as a really discouraging sign in much of the defence world and an indicator that Britain may push back against NATO's anticipated initiatives in a few weeks. Prime Minister Starmer's refusal to commit to a timeline to raise defence spending to 3% only added fuel to that fire, and it raised concerns that the talk of a NATO-first defence approach might have just been hot air. The Defence Policy Chief for Britain's political opposition, James Cartledge, accused the government of failing to show that it can fund its programmes at all. According to defence insiders interviewed by British media, Britain will commit to the targets that NATO will set out, and if true, then those concerns might be addressed. But there's no guarantee as of now. Either way, the UK's leaders will face a moment of truth on that subject in the very near future, once NATO convenes on June the 24th. A larger problem, however, is the sheer and pervasive vagueness of the entire plan. While the Strategic Defence Review does make plenty of specific call-outs, when it comes to identifying Britain's problems, it's been widely described as light on actionable solutions. That's a choice that could be interpreted in one of two ways, depending on whether you're feeling like being charitable or critical. On the one hand, the relative lack of action items may reflect the rapidly shifting dynamics of the wider world, where the UK is having to drastically rethink its defence strategy on short timelines and is sharing what it can when it can. In keeping with that train of thought, it might also be unrealistic to assume that the Ministry of Defence would seek to disclose the full details of its military plans in a public document, and a document that the Kremlin is likely to analyse with a painstaking degree of thoroughness. On the other hand, the alternative is that the government doesn't actually have concrete plans to address many of the issues that it's called out. In that interpretation, this great big radical defence review might simply be hot air, a wish list assembled by bloviating politicians with no plan or inclination to actually follow through with it. According to British officials speaking anonymously, the relative lack of detail was intentional, but only time is going to tell whether they can follow up or whether, on defence matters, Britain's eyes might be bigger than its stomach. But the fundamental problem underneath all the more specific problems that might arise as time goes on is the simple fact that even the best laid plans can often come to nothing. In an ideal world, Britain is able to implement its new strategy as it's been developed and pour money, time, and human resources into a grand initiative. But in reality, the Ministry of Defence and the Labour government will need to maintain a constant stream of funds without distraction or interruption in order to pay for all of these initiatives. It'll have to overcome countless technical hurdles in various areas, endure setbacks, deal with crises of public opinion, and overcome the bureaucratic inertia of the nation's institutions. It'll have to endure unexpected distractions and crises that demand the government shift its focus. It'll have to be adjusted continuously in order to stay ahead of a modern warfare environment that's always evolving. It'll have to endure inevitable delays, even if the initial cash streams are turned on quickly, which is no guarantee in itself. And it'll have to survive the pressures of political expediency, both in future years, when the Labour government could score easy political points by abandoning unpopular initiatives or spending elsewhere, and in a world where Labour loses its mandate and the nation is again led by a government that doesn't share that vision. To put it simply, a bigger and more ambitious plan comes with more and more potential points of failure. And with an initiative as massive as an overhaul of British defence itself, there will be failures along the way. Britain can endure those setbacks. It can keep its focus and continue to work toward its broad objectives. But there are no guarantees that it will. Even still, there are reasons to hold out hope. At the most basic level, it's a hell of a lot easier to succeed by pursuing one's strengths than by relying on one's weaknesses. And the simple fact that the UK has reoriented its defence strategy toward its own strengths suggests that all future time and money will be better spent than if Britain had remained on its prior course. The government appears willing to devote the requisite funding, and already has plans to do so in some cases. The immense number of action items within Britain's new strategy does introduce many points of failure, but they also allow Britain to pursue many initiatives at once, with failure in one or two areas unlikely to impact forward progress in many others. There are indicators that Britain will boost its defence spending, as expected this summer, and the review does come with specific recommendations on how to rapidly innovate, design, procure, and proliferate the tools it needs. British private corporations are ready to leap into the gap. Early capital is already set aside, and the rest of the NATO alliance appears quite happy to help Britain along if it can meet its spending targets like it's supposed to. Perhaps most important of all, the report's authors and the British government understand that the nation's back is up against a wall, and that after so many years of atrophy, it must take decisive action now if it's going to have any chance at staying relevant in the future. So, will Britain's new grand strategy be enough? Well, maybe not, but the logic's sound, the path forward is reasonably clear, and the alternative is to languish in a state of atrophy that the nation's government has finally recognised and made a long-awaited commitment to address. The UK's military has been desperately in need of an overhaul for a really long time, and its leaders have precisely one strategic pathway at their disposal in order to make that overhaul happen. It's now or never. It's this strategy or nothing, and if the United Kingdom is serious about finally getting its together, then it knows what needs to be done. Could it fail? Yeah, but the nation has been failing on defence for decades. If this grand strategic approach doesn't work, then Britain's just back to where it was yesterday. Thank you for watching.